they'll be stuck in traffic in Germany, and they won't actually get to the Baltic in time to be relevant.
Yeah, just imagine.
So in a sense, it might end up being easy for the Russians to move around across European borders than it would be for Europeans to move across Allied borders.
500 is a lot.
500 across the entire continent, but yes, 500 is a lot. This is the human element of war, and just questions of basic chance and timing and everything. Things you can't imagine ahead of time, but they will happen. The fact that it occurred on the other side of the world from Russia doesn't make an appearance in this narrative. That Russia was never part of this discussion doesn't make an appearance in the narrative. It's just bad history.
War is changing. Or is it? We live in a high-tech world, but on the battlefield, things keep getting back to something older, harsher, and much more primitive. This is Inflection Zero. I'm Shomek Mukherjee, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Lukas Milevski. He's a military strategist at Leiden University of Netherlands. And now, my conversation with Lukas. Lukas, welcome to Inflection Zero.
Thank you for inviting me.
President Donald Trump called NATO a paper tiger and publicly criticized, almost insulted UK and French leaders. Is this how power really works behind the diplomacy, or is it chaos in NATO right now?
So it's probably a bit of both, but also a bit of neither. In the sense that the Trump administration and the people that Trump has surrounded himself with are people who very much believe in the material realities of power and not much beyond that. They like to consider themselves hardcore realists. They invoke Thucydides, these sorts of people. That famous quote from Thucydides, "The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." That's basically their slogan. But and there was also that a few weeks ago, there was that alleged incident where Elbridge Colby, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, was lecturing a representative from the Catholic Church about power and all this, and he's allegedly said something along the lines of what was it? That the United States is strong enough that it can do anything it wants in the world. And that may or may not be true, but it misses a much bigger point, one which it seems, at this point in time at least, that the Americans and Israelis are running headfirst into when it comes to the war in Iran, which is, it's fine to have the power to do what you want, but that doesn't mean you have the power to achieve what you want. They're doing what they want in Iran, but they're not achieving what they want in Iran. There is a difference between the two, and this whole focus on just the sheer material realities of power has blinded the current Trump administration, as well as various others, to this basic point. We saw it again with Greenland, of course, at the beginning of the year as well. You can do what you want, but you can't achieve what you want. So in this sense, what we can see in the context of NATO is that Trump is doing what he wants, sort of saying what he wants within certain limitations, because for the US to leave NATO, that would require an act of Congress, and Congress, on this point at least, on the point of participation in NATO, is still acting as something of a countermeasure to Trump. Not always particularly effectively, but there is something still there.
Some guardrails.
Some. But he's saying all sorts of nonsense. If we think about NATO credibility and the notion of a paper tiger, well, there's a sense in which NATO has had credibility issues since the very beginning of the alliance. Could NATO credibly defend Western Europe from the Warsaw Pact in the 1950s or 60s? question mark. Obviously this is an ahistorical scenario. It never actually happened. We don't know, but they're not particularly well prepared to do so.
But can NATO defend Europe if US backs off?
That is the $1 million question. I mean, $1 million isn't enough for the question, really, but that is a big question.
Yeah, it's $1 trillion question, probably.
Yeah, it's $1 trillion question. It is, but it is the big question because there's so many moving parts you have to keep into consideration. For first of all, who are we fighting? Presumably Russia, but what does the Russia which we hypothetically will be fighting actually look like? What does their military look like, and so on and so forth? The Russians themselves say that the military they have now is not the military they had at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Or at least there are parts of the Russian military which have basically become nothing more than the site of organized crime because of how they conscripted so many people out of the Siberian prisons and whatnot, hardcore criminals, and they're just rebuilding their criminal networks in the middle of the Russian army on active campaign and getting rid of people who try to stand up to them. So there are these sorts of issues. And then what scenario are we talking about? Are we talking about a full-scale Russian invasion of sort of European NATO? Where does it happen? So on and so forth. But then there's also
let's say it happens through the Balkan countries.
Balkan or Baltic?
Sorry, Baltic. Yes, Estonia.
Yes. Well, again, here is questions of what does the scenario actually look like? Where do they go? How do they start? So on and so forth. But then it's also a question of, okay, so in principle, European NATO does have more military power. If you again measure it in just sheer material terms than Russia. And even more, even in terms of just simply counting the humans involved, the number of people involved. But that's the question of how many of them would actually be operationally ready? How quickly can they be made operationally ready? How quickly can they actually move from their home bases to the front? And here we then get into questions of the infrastructure networks of Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. How quickly can formations move? Not just the people, but the heavy equipment and so on and so forth. And there are issues here. I mean, Ben Hodges, retired Lieutenant General, who had been commander of U.S. Army Europe, has been banging on about military mobility in Europe for at least a decade now, I think.
What do you mean by mobility? Is it the logistics part or just mobilize men?
No, just being able to get military forces from point A to point B. Logistics and transport, but it's more than just that because it's a question of what does the infrastructure look like? Mm-hmm. There's like, and this is one of the sort of the classic examples. Tunnels blasted through mountains in Germany and whatnot are too small to accommodate Patriot systems. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do with that? Then there's issues of...
So what do you do with that?
You either find alternative paths or you make the tunnel larger, presumably. It's one or the other. Or you give up. That's also an option, but one which I hope we don't prefer. But then there's also questions of bureaucracy, because it's very difficult for Allied forces to cross borders in Europe, because you have to fill out any number of forms. It's easier if you're an invading country, because if you're invading, by definition, you don't care about customs, right? So in a sense, it might end up being easy for the Russians to move around across European borders than it would be for Europeans to move across Allied borders. But as a good example of this, there's the U.S. Transport Command based in Poland. I don't remember which number it is off the top of my head. Their job basically is to rotate U.S. brigades in and out of Europe. 4 brigades a year. That's it. And just 4 brigades requires this transport command to fill out, depending on the country and the form and whatnot, either digitally or on paper, about 1 million forms per year. That's for 4 brigades. Supposedly, NATO defense plans call for, in case of war in the east, call for NATO to move 100 brigades eastward. That is a lot of paperwork if the bureaucracy isn't sort of streamlined and made more rational.
But yeah, so I have a question here. So let's say that's the bureaucracy now in peacetime. Well, you can argue it's not really a peacetime, it's pre-war time, or I'll let you define how would you categorize this time. But in the time of war, those bureaucracy, does it get stripped out or they just clog up things?
So, I mean, in that regard, bureaucracies are a lot like militaries in that they do what they're accustomed to doing and how they're accustomed to doing it. And they're often, and bureaucracies in particular, are not necessarily the best at adapting to changing circumstances. And so and if they were to sort of not do their job, then essentially that would be unlawful on their part. So the problem is then that you would have to, in legal terms, then end up defining what they need to do or indeed not do, also in wartime. But then, because we can anticipate, presumably, that there will be some level of strategic warning of any Russian invasion, because if it's a full-scale sort of invasion, if we look back to January 2022, we could see the signs that the Russians were preparing for real action. Presumably, we'd see similar signs, a similar buildup, similar development of that very specific military infrastructure which we need to help sustain operations, things like the oil pipelines, field hospitals, and so on and so forth. We presumably would see that, which means then we can begin mobilizing and begin moving troops. But that's still peacetime. So then all the customs issues still apply. So it's something which needs to be streamlined in general, but also needs to be then probably further streamlined in the specific context of war. And that should, NATO conducted a study together with the EU a couple of years ago now, I think, where they identified what they called hotspots, 500 hotspots in the sort of European transport infrastructure, which need to be improved to enable effective, or at least more effective, military mobility by Allied forces across Europe.
500 choke points?
Yeah, so some of them would be physical infrastructure, things like bridges, tunnels, and whatnot. Some of them would be more in terms of sort of bureaucratic practices and whatnot. But all of these sorts of things, just 500 things which need money thrown at them to improve these things. Money, time.
So it's not just logistics or bureaucracy; it could be anything, like 500 choke points or like friction points.
So my understanding is that there are more choke points where military mobility would slow down for one reason or another.
I see. 500 is a lot.
500 across the entire continent, but yes, 500 is a lot.
Wow.
And they're currently their current thinking is they are identifying specific high priority corridors through Europe, which are essentially their priority to address the hotspots which occur in those corridors first before others. We don't know exactly what those corridors are because that's secret information.
Yeah.
But not in detail, but you can imagine, from like somehow the port of Rotterdam, which is the biggest port in Europe, or one of them certainly, across Germany in some way, then up through Poland into Lithuania and so on.
I see.
So that they prioritize infrastructure and practices along there, or like from the Adriatic into Romania and that sort of stuff.
Interesting. Interesting. So, can Europe defend itself?
Or part of the answer to the question as it currently stands is, well, could Europe win a war against Russia? Well, could the European armed forces get to the battlefield in time actually to fight? Question mark. And this is something which does bother some people. Like I know in the Dutch Ministry of Defense, there's at least a handful of officials who are waging a bit of an insurgency to try to convince the policymakers to help or to greenlight sort of for deployment of Dutch forces or more Dutch forces, because they are present in the battle group in Lithuania, to the Baltic. Because what effect do they have, like in terms of potential deterrent effect, if Russia looks at them in the Netherlands and thinks, well, they'll be stuck in traffic in Germany and they won't actually get to the Baltic in time to be relevant?
Yeah, just imagine. It's something along that line. Well, not the army, happened in 6 Day War between Israel and Egypt, where the timing was as such that most of the generals were on their way to work and they were stuck at traffic and they just couldn't get to work on time.
I mean, this is the human element of war, and just questions of basic chance and timing and everything. Things you can't imagine ahead of time, but they will happen in some way or another, in some place or another.
In the first 10 weeks of war in Ukraine, like the Russian, I don't know, special military operation, whatever they called it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If Ukraine broke through, I don't know, most of the assumptions, right? Like territorial war in Europe is over, right? That. So, what's the point of strategy if the basic points doesn't hold?
Well, the point of strategy is because ultimately, strategy is a combination of some multiple logics together. We tend to think of it often in linear terms. It's about using your means to achieve your ends. Instrumental logic purely. That's a basic. Without that, there's nothing else, right? But this is generally a very linear logic. It's very simple. I want to write something down. I pick up a pen. I write. That's instrumental logic in a nutshell. But that's not strategy. It's part of strategy, but it's not strategy itself. Then you have adversarial logic. You're doing this against an enemy. Like the piece of paper I'm writing on isn't trying to fight back. The Ukrainians fought back against the Russians. There's also what I call the alchemical logic of strategy. My PhD supervisor was Professor Colin Gray, and he liked to use the metaphor of currency conversion. That military power and political consequence are two very different things, and you have to convert between the two. And Colin sort of described that as currency conversion. But the problem with, and it's a decent metaphor, but the problem with it is that if you change from dollars to euros, or from yen to yuan, or whatever, that's still money being changed into money. Whereas really what strategists are doing is alchemy. They're trying to change lead into gold. And for medieval alchemists, that didn't really work out particularly well. For strategists, it does work out better. But it does depend on the quality of the inputs. And what we see in the case of 2022 is that the inputs into Russian strategy were just really, really bad. And the inputs into Western, both European and American for different reasons, observations and interpretations of all this could at times also be quite bad. And then for the Ukrainians, again, for different reasons, they could also be quite bad, or were also quite bad at that time. The only one who gets totally failing marks would be the Russians, in this case.
Why?
Because they came in with political assumptions about Ukraine, which maybe 30 years ago would have been broadly tenable. But 4 years ago, and especially after Crimea and Donbass in 2014, were no longer relevant. But they basically is very much, it's a combination of the essential Russian imperialistic mindset combined with a very distinct national chauvinism, sort of cultural national chauvinism, in which they believe that fundamentally the Ukrainians are Russians who don't know that they're Russians. And it turns out that at the very latest, 2014 ruined any hope of that. But the Russians didn't realize. So they came in expecting that they'll be greeted as liberators. You know, if you go back and sort of listen to or read transcripts of Putin's speeches at the very beginning of the war, on the day of the war, and then, which was a Thursday, as I recall, and then a second speech on Saturday of the very first weekend, both times, there's a sense in which he was addressing the Ukrainian public and basically saying, we're not here to fight you, we're here to fight, as sort of he said at the time, your drone Nazi regime who you don't like. But it turns out that he completely misjudged the relationship between Zelensky's government and the Ukrainian people, as well as the Ukrainian people themselves, as well as also Zelensky himself.
Over the years, Ukraine have developed an identity, and it's not Russian.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's the fundamental he missed. Also, do you remember just before the war, Putin had like a huge podium, and all his chiefs, army chiefs, and his security chiefs, and his spy chief, everybody was sitting. Mm. And he kind of dressed down his spy chief, who didn't really, I don't know what he was trying to say, but he was kind of mumbling his way through, yeah, I support it, but not right now, but I like whatever that was. Yes. So was there like reasonable voices telling him the truth? He just didn't want to listen, or what was going on inside?
I mean, in a sense, we can't know because, I wasn't there. But, I think that's a great example of just sort of judging from at least what we saw. And of course, this is what the Kremlin wanted audiences to see, right? But it was very much about, how should I put this? Putin is in control. He's making everyone else basically dance to his tune. No one else really necessarily knows what the tune actually is. From what's his name? Sergei Narishin, something like that. Something like that.
The spy chief?
Yes.
Yeah. And I felt bad for him on that day. He was kind of like, I think he was like scared for his life or whatever.
He didn't really know what Putin was asking, what Putin wanted. But then at the same time, this just increases the chances that he's just trying to tell Putin what he wants to hear. And there is this sort of a much longer Russian sort of cultural tradition of, and this is something which we have seen also throughout the war, as it's gone on so far, of where it's the notion of, or the myth of the good Tsar, that Putin is never at fault for any of the problems. It's his advisors always misinforming him and whatnot. And therefore, those who are actually suffering on the ground are trying to get direct messages through to Putin himself, by recording them from the front line, directly addressing, Putin, and trying to explain the situation, trying to sort of bypass the liars in the Kremlin. And of course, and the Russians do in other ways also complain about how there's an essential communication breakdown among levels of the military hierarchy, going, starting from at the front to, headquarters, and then from one headquarters to another, all the way up to the Kremlin. So by the time that any information actually reaches the Kremlin, it's probably been so sanitized. But that's not something which is necessarily the fault of any one particular individual or any one particular sort of level of hierarchy. It's something which is endemic throughout the whole system in many respects. That it is difficult to get good information. The Russians call this reporting on credit, or something along those lines, where basically they'll report good news which hasn't happened yet. Yes, we've taken this village. Okay, now that I've reported that we've taken the village, you actually go have to take it. I don't care how you do it, just go and do it. But as far as everyone knows, otherwise, the village is taken, which means Putin can proudly proclaim, or Gerasimov can proudly proclaim, that Kupiansk has been taken. Again, perhaps, or whatever. And then if that village or that town or whatever is the responsibility of one particular unit, the units on either side, as far as they're aware, that village is taken because that's what they've been told. And then they do things, but they're doing things with a complete disregard of actual reality on the ground because the village hasn't been taken yet, and therefore they themselves then take losses they didn't expect, and so on and so forth. So there are all these sort of ripple effects from this habit of claiming success on credit. That it will happen. It just sort of hasn't yet.
At this point, Russia has lost what, 1 million plus soldiers, and taken heavy losses, right? And we also see the same thing in Iran. Iran is taking heavy losses, military losses, right? But they're not really backing down. On the other hand, couple of thousand casualties on the West, that's a huge, huge blowback politically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that kind of mindset, can the West ever win another war?
Also, part of the issue is that, if Iran backs down, where to?
Right.
If
for Iran, it's existential. For Russia, it isn't, right?
But they think it is. That's the thing.
Russia think it's existential?
There is a degree to which they do think it is existential. There's a sense in Russia, and you may have heard this sort of phrase that Russia is not an empire without Ukraine. Russia has difficulties being a great power, has difficulties being an empire unless it controls Ukraine. So just sort of in terms of the material resource, in terms of the human resources and so on, many of the great scientists, many of the great generals of Russian history, of Soviet history, were Ukrainian. Some of their iconic tanks or other pieces of military equipment were designed in sort of design bureaus in Ukraine, not in Russia, and so on and so forth. So there's this sort of element to it as well. There's also the historiographical element, where Russia is essentially waging a historiographical war against Ukraine, in the sense that they want to take over the history of the Rus. But the real sort of ancestry of the Rus is Ukrainian. Kiev was the great city of the Rus back when Moscow was essentially a swamp. But because then Peter the Great transformed Muscovy into Russia, so-called, claiming that historical heritage for for Moscow. This is just sort of part of that sense of trying to ensure that this is who the Russians are, and this is who we think of when we think of Russians. That this glorious history they're trying to usurp from the Ukrainians. And then added on top of that, the Russians are really paranoid.
Paranoid in what sense?
Every sense.
You mean Russian people or the regime?
Oh no, this is cultural as well. But they see themselves as a besieged fortress, being besieged by the West, and the West is trying to take Ukraine away from them, and therefore they're waging a defensive war to maintain Ukraine in their own backyard. This, of course, ignores, again, the Russian imperialist mindset, ignores the fact that Ukraine has its own political agency, and the Ukrainians can choose whichever direction they want to choose, which the Russians have a lot of problems with, because that just suggests that they might not actually be Russians again. But then, and this element of the besieged fortress has sort of various, a couple of other bits to it. So one of things like the revolutions, Maidan, or you can go back to the Arab Spring, the Orange Revolution in, 2004 in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the Bulldozer Revolution in Serbia, which deposed Milosevic. You can go back to the Singing Revolution in the occupied Baltic states at the end of the 1980s. The Russians see all of these, more or less, as illegitimate CIA-backed coups against legitimate, often pro-Russian governments. They see Western soft power as subversion.
Also, the NATO expansion played a bit of a role in this, do you think?
I'll address that question in a moment. Let me finish my sort of current thought first on this. So sort of when we talk about hybrid warfare a decade ago, we also Russia hybrid warfare. Oh, the Russians do hybrid warfare. The Russians never believed that they did hybrid warfare. They always thought that we were doing this sort of thing against them, and so they see this sort of, if not necessarily like nationally or sort of in a state manner, but sort of culturally existential threat. And then alongside that, they remember their history, often in terms of military invasions, of them being invaded, predominantly from the West. So was it in 2015, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, wrote an article, or at least an article was written, and then his name was put at the top of it, published on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and he basically says, this was on 1914, 1915, something like that, or sorry, 2014, 2015. And he's saying that it's been 60 years since victory in World War II. It's been 100 since World War I started. It's been 200 since Napoleon invaded. It's been 400 since the Poles invaded and occupied Moscow and so on. They're just, their recollection, their historical memory sort of revolves around these invasions of Russia from the West. And again, that just feeds into the besieged sort of fortress narrative. And then when you get to the NATO and other countries, ex-Warsaw Pact countries, and indeed ex-Soviet republics, as the Baltic states were, joining NATO. This has been, in many ways, a moving target for the Russians, because at like in the 90s, Russia had nothing really to say about like Poland or other ex-Warsaw Pact states joining. When the Baltic states joined in 2004, Putin was also fine with that. This was not a problem. This was, of course, also sort of in some ways at the height of the partnership between Russia and the West in the context of the war on terror, but it wasn't a problem, and so on and so forth. Going a bit further, the mention in the Bucharest summit in 2006 or 8 of potential membership for Ukraine and Georgia in time left incredibly vague. Perhaps rang some alarm bells for the Russians. And one of the alleged reasons why they invaded Georgia was to try to drive the prospect of membership off the table. Some of that may also have motivated their actions in Ukraine from 2014 onward, but compared to all the other motivations, I don't see that necessarily being a big one. And we sort of see how much NATO membership necessarily really bothers the Russians when Finland and Sweden joined, and Russia said essentially nothing. It just didn't matter for them. Of course, by that point, they're waging their big war in Ukraine, so their attention was elsewhere. But
it didn't matter, or they just couldn't do anything about it?
So with Sweden and Finland, I think it's both. They couldn't do anything about it, but also it didn't matter, because they didn't even say anything much.
Why wouldn't it matter, though? It's right on their border.
It's right on their border, but in practical terms, both Sweden and Finland have over the previous 30 years, become very interoperable with NATO forces, to the degree where there are essential political assumptions that if there were to be a European war with Russia, they would also take part in the war. Ultimately, because there's NATO Article 5, but then there's also the Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the EU's mutual defense clause. And they might not have been NATO members, but they were EU members. So in any, presume you would think that both levers would be pulled in case of war, which means that they would be in the war anyway. And the Russians sort of understood this. And the Baltic states, broadly meaningless in terms of changing the military balance, especially prior to 2008, and especially before 2008, and especially still before 2014 and 2016, because prior to 2008 there were no NATO defense plans for defending the Baltic states. They were, in some ways, you could say, perhaps a bit unkindly, that they were sort of second-class citizens in the alliance, because they're a private defensive alliance which was not prepared to protect them. After 2014, after 2008, then it was realized we do need defense plans also for the Baltic states, but then that mostly that at the very least began only as an adjunct to defense plans to defend Poland. So not the Baltic states in their own right, but as part of a broader war. After 2014, and it was realized, okay, the Russians are actually being quite revisionist and we don't like this, then you see essentially the collapse of the Russian NATO Founding Act, which then leads to de facto, if not de jure, which leads then to the NATO 4 deployed battle groups, initially battalion size from 2016, and then from 2023, 2024, gradually expanding to brigade size. And so what you see here is that the membership of the Baltic states in particular, but also many others, like on the eastern flank, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, does not lead to other NATO armed forces coming closer to Russia. They only came closer as a result of, in response to Russia's own aggression against other countries. So, and much is often made of this notion of a supposed promise not to expand NATO, supposedly made between Western leaders and
Gorbachev, I think was.
and Gorbachev, or indeed Yeltsin, I think possibly both of them, depending on how the story goes.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, Putin made a big story out of it.
yeah, it's nonsense though. It doesn't exist in the historical record.
Yeah, that's exactly the point he makes. He says like, yeah, but what I've learned is like, if it's not on paper, it doesn't exist. So even if they promised verbally that NATO is not going to expand and whatnot, they never put it on paper. Thus, we have to put everything on paper.
No, I mean, and that's a fair point. I mean, Russians ignore paper as well.
Right.
Even paper, let alone anything oral. But I mean, even the notion of a verbal agreement, there's no record of that. Like,
I see.
I think one of the most recent sort of enunciations of this sort of blame NATO, blame the West, would be Jonathan Haslam's recent book. I don't remember the title, but about this specific issue of why the West is to blame for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And he talks about and he cites sources saying that yes, there was an offer made and so on and so forth, but he completely decontextualizes things, sometimes to the point of essentially lying about them. It's like yes, there was like on a particular day, a particular German official made the suggestion of a potential offer along something like those lines. But what's left out is that this was never offered to the Russians. This was in a meeting between the Germans and the Americans as to how maybe this is something we might want to consider doing, and then they never actually did it. The fact that it occurred on the other side of the world from Russia doesn't make an appearance in this narrative. That Russia was never part of this discussion doesn't make an appearance in the narrative. It's just bad history.
However, in the West, we're building AI and precision systems, right? Russia is producing artillery shells, and Ukraine is fighting with, right now, a lot of uptake happening with cheap drones. Iran, on the other hand, is also heavily focusing on the Shahid drones and all the other cheap platforms. What's actually working?
Well, working in what sense?
Tactical advantage.
For tactical advantage.
Yeah, on the ground.
Everything works to some degree or another, because ultimately it's not merely about weapon systems, but who's using them, how they're being used, and against whom, and how those others are also equipped. So, for example, like when we talk about drones and their effectiveness on the battlefield, I mean, because it's commonly said now, and Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, I think, said this at one point, that now 90% of the casualties being inflicted in Ukraine are as a result of drones.
Yeah, more than artillery shells. Yeah,
more than artillery. But then, to what degree is this also a reflection of the military equipment which Russia is using? Some Western analysts, for example, have made the point that neither like Russian tanks or any Russian armored fighting vehicle nor any Ukrainian armored fighting vehicle has APS, those are active protective systems. Basically, broadly speaking, depending on sort of what system we're talking about, like an automated shotgun on the whole to shoot at these sorts of aerial targets. And you can say, okay, maybe that might plausibly negate anything to do with drones that we see in the current war. But then at the same time, you can also say, okay, even if that's true, for how long would that be true before these APS run out of ammunition, and then they become vulnerable again? And would APS then, given how much, especially from beginning in recent months, how much both Russia and especially Ukraine have pushed the use of drones into to focus on the enemy logistics? Are Western armed forces prepared then to put these sorts of protective systems on every single logistical truck driving to and from the front line, because then otherwise they might still get strangled, plausibly speaking. So it becomes very hypothetical, but it's also ultimately about this interaction. But you can say at the same time, the use of Patriots to knock down Shaheds in the Gulf was hugely effective. Just they intercepted, so it was effective.
But it's not cost effective.
It's not cost effective. It's not sustainable. And this is again where Ukraine is demonstrating a good degree of innovation, and the Gulf states, and also the U.S. to some degree, as long as Trump doesn't say anything about it, have been taking advantage of Ukrainian technology and Ukrainian expertise to actually reproduce a multi-layered air defense system, which is suitable also for engaging with these sorts of cheap drones. So it again depends then on how you combine these systems and what systems they're also facing. So it's all incredibly context sensitive, ultimately.
In your paper, I think it was 2016, you said we focus on the high-tech war, but it always goes back to primitive setups.
2023.
2023. 2016 was the nature of warfare, I believe. Strategy versus
yeah.
So 2023 paper, yes. So you say it always keeps getting back to the primitives, the trenches and the logistics, and
there is, I'd say, a natural impulse in war towards that, especially as the sort of cutting edge, the bleeding edge of technology gets ever more advanced, ever more complex and complicated, and more expensive to procure, and therefore you have less of it. Mm-hmm. And as your soldiers become increasingly more trained and competent in sort of sheer professional terms, that again the process gets longer and the cost gets higher and so on, and therefore armed forces shrink. What you then have is losses will happen. Now, even in the aerial campaign against Iran, the U.S. Air Force took casualties. Okay, some of those casualties came as a result of a Kuwaiti Air Force pilot rather than Iran himself, but right. Nonetheless, that's just sort of, in this case, that'd be friction. But the modern stuff gets lost because that's the stuff you're using, and it might get damaged, it might get destroyed, it might get worn down, and it has to go back for repairs, and then what replaces it? Modern stuff until you run out of modern stuff. And because you can't build it sufficiently quickly, and you can't train people on it sufficiently quickly, eventually you might end up having to rely on less sophisticated stocks which you have accumulated. Mm-hmm. And similarly with people. The professionals go and fight, and then they take casualties. Mm-hmm. And then how do you, with whom do you replace them? And especially under the context of, or the pressure of major war, you might be replacing a lot of casualties quite quickly. And so can your sort of manpower systems and manpower policies cope with this sort of thing? And so this is what we had been seeing to a certain degree in Ukraine, where where the Russians increasingly pulled out more and more primitive tanks from Siberia to use at the front in some capacity or another, because they sort of lost their modern tanks earlier on, and to a certain degree with Ukraine as well, and similarly with manpower. And loss of manpower then also affects how the organization itself works. So the organization becomes more primitive because it can no longer do all the many professional tasks as well as it could before, because it doesn't have the people anymore. And there's a possibility of sort of the formation as a social organization also perhaps beginning to break down, and just bonds among soldiers potentially breaking because, well, this is just some new guy who appeared yesterday. He'll probably die tomorrow. why should I even bother learning his name? So it primitivizes, but it's not. And of course, now with sort of the benefit of an extra 2.5 years of hindsight on that article now, continuing to observe the war, you can say that this isn't a linear process, where that might happen to certain formations more clearly than to others. Others, might still get the focus of better recruits and so on and so forth to try to keep them up to scratch as much as possible. And then you might see, because of the sort of primitivization, including among manpower, a turn to other technologies, but cheap technologies. Here we're coming back to drones,
right,
to try to replace humans as much as possible on the battlefield, and to try to replace this apparently vulnerable, heavier equipment on the battlefield as well. So that's not as much a primitivization as sort of a reorientation of where battlefield technology is going, at least in that specific context. But I mean, war is generally destructive, and if armies, if militaries are not prepared for that, if they're not prepared to replace their own things which are destroyed, whether that's stuff or people, then they will become just fundamentally less capable organizations. Perhaps to the point of being completely ineffective, but that again depends on other specific contextual details. A good example of this, which recently came out in the news just in the past couple of days, as of, I don't know when you'll be publishing this, but since we're speaking on the 27th of April, I think the news appeared over the weekend, because as early or as late as December last year, in Ukraine, Seversk was the town of Seversk was still in Ukrainian hands, and then in a couple of weeks, it just seemed like the entire situation collapsed, and Seversk was taken by the Russians, which seemed somewhat unthinkable because it was such a stable sort of sector of the front for so long. And in part, this is because the relevant Ukrainian brigades in the area were primitivized in certain key ways. Loss of manpower, and they try to replace the manpower with drones, but then they relied excessively on the drones, and as a result, the training that their sort of frontline infantry had to try to hold the front line should the Russians actually reach the front line was totally insufficient. And the end result was therefore, and at the same time, because the Ukrainian army remains in some ways, or at least in some formations, an ex-Soviet army, much like the Russian one, there was also this this problem of reporting bad news up the chain of command and whatnot. So the brigades there portrayed conditions too favorably for too long, such that when the Russians actually imposed enough pressure, it all collapsed, because they're relying on technology which, in that case, ceased to be enough. Their infantry capabilities were too untrained, too primitive to hold the line, and then no one was ready to adapt because no one was prepared for bad news to come out of the sector until it was too late. And so Seversk fell.
Yeah, so it's bad news getting stuck in the pipeline. It seems like a problem on both ends in this conflict, at least. I don't know how it is in Iran.
Can be.
Hi. If you think this is informative, useful, or interesting, please subscribe. Now, back to the conversation. I'm not sure how it is in Iran, but in Israel, well, I'm saying Israel because I am in Israel, and I'm kind of,
Yes.
we're going through this war for almost 2 years now, since October 7th, right? I think the best thing about, I mean, I don't want to say the best thing. The one positive thing about Israel is the bad news comes first. like it blows up first. Like one casualty, one soldier died, like everybody's on the streets mourning for him. So that, I think that does help, at least in the decision making. But we have other issues, like any other country.
Yes.
If you have time, we'll get to those as well. So let's talk about deterrence for a second, right? So we rely on deterrence to keep the peace. If you look at the last 4 years, a lot of red lines had been crossed. And if the only action the West takes is sanctions, what's the point of deterrence?
Well, the thing with deterrence to remember is that it is it is inherently contingent, because Western militaries in particular, but also increasingly militaries around the globe, like to think in terms of effects. And we're going to achieve this effect, we're going to achieve that effect. Now, the problem is they're thinking about effects tends to be quite sloppy. We can talk about that later if you like. But when it comes specifically to deterrence, deterrence is an effect. It's something which results from a particular posture we have, force posture, or whatever. But we have no control over it because it is up to the adversary to choose to be deterred. It is up to the adversary, Russia or Iran or China or whoever, to say to look across the border and think, ooh, I'd rather not. Right? It's their choice. We can put whatever we want on our side of the border to help them make the choice we want them to make, but ultimately they can still decide, I'm going for it. And we don't know when it works and when it doesn't.
The enemy gets a vote.
In a sense, the enemy has the only vote. And in terms of knowing whether or not it works, this is something that I always like to ask. On the 23rd of February, 2022, if I were to ask you, why hasn't Russia invaded Ukraine? Would you say, is it because they're not actually interested in doing so? Would you say they're deterred from doing so? Or do you say they simply have not done it yet?
I've said they just simply hasn't done it yet.
Yet. But how do you know the difference between no interest, deterred, and yet? Those are very fine lines when you have very imperfect information.
Yeah, it's hard to tell from the other side what's going on. But I think what I'm trying to get to is the cost of de-escalation. I mean, we see that in the Iran war. If you didn't start the war, negotiate as much as you want. But if you've gone in and after 6 weeks of bombardment, if you just pull out and say, like, now we're going to talk because Iran has said that they're going to open the Straits of Hormuz. Well, they didn't, and it's not open. Now we are imposing blockade, not a quarantine, a proper blockade. Every time they say, we're not coming to Islamabad, we're not talking, we're still sort of either second guessing or kind of trying to de-escalate without really, it seems sloppy. So what I'm saying is, if you're already in the war and at least tactically, if you're winning, why de-escalate in the middle of it?
Well, I mean, Iran, just in general, my impression of Iran is that it's been a very sloppy war from start to finish. Just built upon the same sort of wishful thinking which underpinned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That all we need to do is show some force, bomb some guys, and then guys we like will come to power on a wave of perhaps popular revolt, because back in January there was there were all those riots in the streets and whatnot, and just thinking this would be easy. Again, this sort of comes back to what I was saying at the very beginning about being able to do anything you want in the world, but still not being able to achieve anything you want in the world. And ultimately, it's at the point where what is left to bomb? Yes, you can bomb civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, this sort of stuff, much of which is in principle protected by the laws of war. So doing so would be war crimes. Not a good look. Not that necessarily the people in charge would care about those things. But then it's basically, in a sense, my sense is that this is a no-win scenario for the U.S. in particular, Israel to a lesser extent, because Israel didn't care as much about things like regime change. I mean, supposedly Mossad promised Netanyahu regime change would be easy.
That's an idea floating around. Nobody really knows.
Yeah, nobody knows, but that's why I said supposedly.
Yeah, right. Right.
But otherwise, for Israel, it's basically do damage to Iran's nuclear program. In the same way that it's the same sort of mowing the grass strategy, which doesn't solve anything. It just kicks the can down the road in ways which just aggravates the rest of the world, essentially.
Right.
But still, in many ways, makes a lot of rational sense if you're in Israel's position.
Right.
So it's in some ways sensible and nonsensical at the same time. But it's, so both understandable and not understandable. For the Americans, sort of, they seem to have bought more in on this regime change thing up until they realized it didn't work. And then what did they expect with the Straits of Hormuz? For them, this was a geopolitical situation which they could live with, the Americans, because they have lived with it. Yes, there were certain costs associated with it because Iran was active throughout the region and the greater region with its proxies and so on and so forth, causing some instability here and there. But you can live with that because we did live with that for the better part, since 1979, essentially. And indeed, even before then, Iran was doing similar things, just not under the banner of the Islamic Republic. And now, if America wants to restore freedom of navigation to the Straits of Hormuz against an unwilling Iran, that means retaining naval assets in the region to keep the straits clear of mines and whatnot. It means probably some degree of a ground presence in Iran itself to try to push the sort of Iranian forces away from the straits so that they can't lob, because they can launch mines into the straits by rocket and whatnot. So you got to push them far enough away that they can't do that. So basically, you're looking at an actual ground invasion of Iran, even if it's only essentially quite limited, but a ground invasion for which there is no natural endpoint.
And also, I don't think there is appetite in American people for it.
No. So basically, they're trying to de-escalate because they're trying to entice something which is sufficiently workable to replace what actually was workable, which worked before and is now broken. The bull entered the shop, broke the china's broken on the floor, and now they're trying to piece things together again. And de-escalation of some kind seems more attractive than the sort of escalation which would be necessary to, or which appears necessary to do the job they sort of which would be needed to open the straits. So they have no good options.
No, one option I can think of is this, which would be there could be a case made to bomb the energy sector. This is part of the revenue from it also goes to Hezbollah or Hamas or Houthis. So there could be a case made to avoid the war crimes that it's not exactly civilian infrastructure we're hitting. We're hitting a bit harder and a bit more economically, but it's still strategic and it's military. And if that happens, then you back off. There is enough discontent inside Iran, and there is Mossad and CIA on the ground to basically engineer an uprising. The regime wouldn't fall tomorrow, but 6 months down the line, 9 months down the line, or a year down the line, right? It will eventually happen if you keep the pressure on and keep the the revenues close. What do you think of?
So I'm probably more on the skeptical side. In one regard, if societies tend to be more resilient than we give them credit for. You can go back to the 1920s. You can go back a century to the original theories on air power, and it's basically, we'll just bomb the shit out of them, and that'll win us the war. And it's never worked fundamentally. So there's a valid question to ask: why should now be any different? And maybe it is different. Who knows? But the case needs to be made against the weight of the entire history of air power and rocketry and so on to date.
The argument is not that we're going to bomb them into submission. I think the idea is that we're going to bomb them enough so they cannot pay their Besieged forces anymore, or the IRGC guys, or whatever militia they're bringing from Iraq. They can't pay them anymore. The economy is in the ruins. So the protests come back to hit the regime once and for all, and it kind of falls. So instead of like, we're going to bomb them into submission. I don't think anybody thinks that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, I don't know enough about Iran to be able to say anything intelligent about that. So maybe not. It depends on a lot of conditions lining up.
That is sort of also the position of I wouldn't say all the Gulf countries, but UAE, for example. Like once the war started, they didn't want it to stop right now. It kind of makes no sense because you're giving Iranians an incentive to now run for the nuclear weapons. Until now, I mean, it's not that hard of a technology. I mean, if they really wanted to do it, they could have done it in 6-7 months. They haven't done it just to avoid this war. Now the war happened, they're like, what are we waiting for? So that gives them incentive, right? So I think UAE and Saudis and definitely Israel, I don't think these countries right now want to stop the war. They're like, can we finish it? Because right now, I don't think we did anything. We just made it worse.
It did make it worse, yes. And of course, Trump, he has, his relationship with reality is, it is what it is, let's say. It's not great at the best of times.
Is it because of the information flow to him, or is it just the way he operates?
I mean, I think there's a sense of both. He's just like that. But then also, he surrounded himself with people who think about and see the world in a certain way and are therefore prone to interpreting it in a way which then is reflected in sort of how he then behaves from there on out. But in America, there's suggestions that because of the Iran war, the Republicans are going to be, or potentially might be annihilated in the midterms, because this is very much a Republican war, and it's Trump's war because of gas prices. So there's a sense in which he wants to control, or he wants to bring the cost of gas back down. And if he can do that by de-escalating, then he will. And if that leaves his allies in the lurch, I mean, when has Trump ever cared about anyone other than himself? That is an acceptable price of doing business for him.
Do you see de-escalation succeeding in bringing the gas price down? I don't see it right now.
No.
Straits of Hormuz is gone. And it's gone for good. As long as this regime is there, it's gone.
Yeah, no. But again, this then comes back to Trump's relationship with reality, and his emphasis on always his belief that there's always a deal to be had. I mean, perhaps, especially when there isn't, given Trump's cognitive capacities and his mental state and all of that. Because if there's a sense in which there's not a deal to be had, no matter what, then that sort of repudiates his whole worldview that everything has a price and that he can pay that price.
Right. I think the whole okay. So after the 12-day war last year in 2025, nobody was thinking about Iran. Right? We were talking about Greenland. I don't know what that fiasco was about. We can talk about it, but nobody was talking about Iran, right? I think it's the protests and then the suppression by the regime and the killing of 30, 40,000 protesters. I mean, I know the numbers are contested, but like thousands of people died in a couple of days. I think that's what brought Iran back to the war maps again. And I think Israel and US made a, I don't know if it's a mistake or they thought that it's a low-hanging fruit right now. And since then it kicked off. And although Trump has said that it's not about regime change, but that was the hope. And you can kind of see it in his eyes, like he's not saying it because he doesn't know if he can achieve it, but that's the hope. But then it kind of became about the nuclear and the missiles and whatnot, right? So that's how I kind of see it, that it all kickstarted because of the protest. And then now we're back into God knows where. And we'll see how the next few weeks unfold. And it can...
Next few weeks, months, years, maybe.
Unless the war starts again. And then there is a genuine chance of a ground invasion and just taking out the regime by force.
Yeah.
De-escalation, I don't see it working.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it'll work, but at the same time, all the other options are, at least currently, more politically costly than the US certainly is willing to pay. Israel might be willing to pay the political cost for some of those options, but then also not for others.
I don't think Israel has a political cost. Right now, I think the Israeli government is happy how close they are with the Gulf countries. I think Israel cares less about the European allies, UK, France, Spain. There is a lot of criticism going on both ways right now. Mm-hmm. So I think Israel cares a lot more about the Gulf countries because they're much more closer to the Israeli position than the Europeans. And politically, there is no cost because the Israeli population already knows that the Hamas, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, every single summer has been a war. Maybe not as big. There were always something. Every summer, we go to the beach and there are rockets. It's either coming from south or north or something. So there is no political cost of the war. The only cost would be if you mess it up so bad, the Hezbollah comes back, the Houthis come back, then the Iranian regime is a lot more radical. That's going to be the cost. Like, what did you do? But America is different. And I have a question in that. So from the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, if the West wasn't chasing democracy in Iraq and feminism in Afghanistan, do you think there will be Russian tanks in Donbass today? I mean, do you think that long-winded war with almost unrealistic goals had a huge effect and put the people of West off from any wars, really, even when it's needed?
So yes and no, and it depends. So there is a sense, certainly, in that the counterinsurgency wars did negatively affect the appetite of Western countries, especially the US, but also others, for major interventions overseas. But that appetite itself was a product of 9/11. You go back to the 1990s, and Edward Luttwak was writing in Foreign Affairs about post-heroic warfare. And for I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of post-heroic warfare, and I'm not sure if your listeners will be, so I'll very briefly describe it. But basically, it's that the basic point of post-heroic warfare is something is happening somewhere in the world, civil war or something, and we are interested in the outcome. We prefer certain outcomes over others. But we're not so interested that we want to put our own people in harm's way. Therefore, we will bomb them from the sky. That's Bosnia, that's Kosovo, and so on. And then you fast forward 10, 15 years, that's principally Libya in 2011 as well. That's Syria during the Syrian civil war. So in some ways, Iraq and Afghanistan were very much exceptions, and they were exceptions as a result of 9/11, especially for Afghanistan, and then just a very particular worldview of the neoconservatives when it came to Iraq. But of course, and this of course also then took sort of American and Western eyes off the potential return of great power competition until it actually returned, and left them sort of questioning whether they're actually ready for great power competition in military terms. Russia and China, to a certain degree, looked at this and sort of looked at how the West, and especially the US, has been, or had been rather, no, it continues to do so, sort of bending international rules, so the international law, to their own geopolitical advantage. Things like humanitarian intervention and whatnot, but still essentially violating sovereignty and whatnot. And you see what like the NATO did in like Kosovo, then Russia uses essentially the same justification in 2008 when it invades Georgia, and then similar sort of use and abuse, if you like, of precedents set by Western behavior then underpin Crimea and Donbass 2014, and so on and so forth, and even as late as 2022, the Russians at least partly framed that as again a humanitarian response to sort of Ukrainian aggression against the so-called separatist republics in the Donbass region. So there's a sense in which, in sort of certain legal senses, it opened the door for this sort of behavior from the Russians. But then at the same time, none of this behavior by the West or the sort of use and abuse of the new precedent set by the Russians would have changed Russian thinking about the role of Ukraine in sort of the broader Russian world, Ruski Mir, So it's entirely plausible that they would have still done something as Ukraine moved away from Russia. Whether they would have done it at the same time, in the same way, for quite the same reasons, and so on and so forth, is a different question, and one which obviously we can't answer because we don't know. But there's a sense in which the West had its part to play, not in terms of provoking Russia, but in terms of giving them sort of certain legal open doors in this regard. But then also long-standing Russian thinking, Russian beliefs, Russian cultural attitudes and whatnot just would have remained constant anyway.
Okay, so there is a segment in the West who sees the Ukraine-Russia war as Putin's war.
Which is nonsense.
That's the question. Like, is it Putin's war, or is the system actually agrees with him?
No, this is a Russian war, I mean, through and through. I mean, the anti-war Russian protests at the beginning of the war were puny. I mean, and they were quickly crushed. Of course, Russia is not exactly the most friendly state in which to conduct protests, but nonetheless, those who opposed the war fled rather than try to change their country. And there's, of course, a second wave of people fleeing the country in the autumn of 2022 when mobilization was announced.
Hmm.
So there are people who were not against the war per se, or not necessarily, probably not, but they were certainly against becoming directly involved in the war.
Right, like somebody else should fight it, not me.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, places like Mariupol and the mass graves there, Bucha, Izium, and all the other places where Russian war crimes are committed. It was not Putin going one by one shooting all these Ukrainians. It was Russians, just Russians. So this is very much a Russian war, a war which very much fits within the Russian sort of cultural world, and one which, for the most part, they have little problem with. And even now, you know, if you read the sort of Russian war bloggers, they're now becoming more critical of even of Putin himself, which is something which was unthinkable even a few months ago. But there's a sense in which they're critical because they still want to win the war. They're not critical of the war, they're critical of how the war is being waged. So this is a Russian war. So when you ask what comes after Putin, well, first off, the question is when might that be? And of course, we don't necessarily know. The system, the war is in line with Russian cultural values, broadly speaking. How well the system will work after Putin is a different question, largely because he has, over the past nearly 30 years now, very much turned himself into the indispensable man, because he's been able to balance all the various interests, all the various clans, which sort of make up the Russian ruling elite, and in a way which allows everyone to trust him sufficiently. But is there anyone of that similar, comparatively neutral stature in Russia who could replace him? And now, obviously, I'm not a Russian scholar, but from what I've read from Russian scholars, there does not seem to be. Instead, what we're seeing, or supposedly seeing, so some people say at least, is that sort of behind the scenes, you're getting increasing competition among various clans in Russia, as they're sort of, and then various interests in Russia as they're jockeying for potential, or for current political power, and then also jockeying for future position. At the moment, it's like Shoigu, the previous Minister of Defense, is part of a very widespread clan which has power, but or has a lot of power. And Shoigu himself has been personally very popular in Russia, because back in the 90s he was the head of the Ministry of Emergency Services, or something along those lines, which was like the one bit of the Russian government in that decade, which appeared to be at all trying to make people's lives better, essentially. So he has a lot. He has a lot of sort of political cachet from that sort of thing. But then his clan is sort of like sparring with Belousov and his clan, and then it's within the security services, like the FSB is gaining power relative to the military, and so on and so forth. And Putin is able to keep a lid on things, but after Putin, it's probably a question mark. And then on top of that, if we consider after Putin, we might also want to consider after the war, whenever that may or may not happen, when the Russian army returns. And as I mentioned before, this isn't the army of 2021, 2022, which was substantially professional, if still clearly not as well prepared. This is an army comprised of, in many cases, literal murderers or other criminals, people who are involved in organized crime, people who are deeply traumatized by the experience of this sort of warfare and so on and so forth. People who may have certain skills which might be highly prized by illegal organizations, and I'm thinking of like drone operators and stuff. We've already seen certainly rumors of how the Mexican cartels have sent people or have learned about sort of drone operations from studying the war in Ukraine, and they've begun doing some of these things themselves and whatnot. So that is itself also going to be a massive problem for Russia after the war. Whatever after the war is, looks like, and when it may or may not happen. Besides, then also after Putin. So there is Russia, much like sort of the US in the Persian Gulf, where it is sort of in sort of a no-win situation. Russia is now also pretty much in a no-win situation. Things, I mean, this is partly as usual for Russia. Things are going to get worse in Russia before they get better. And not just at the level of sort of basic safety on the street, but then also in terms of competition for political power, probably.
All right. So the last question.
Okay.
Before Crimea, people thought the territorial war in Europe is over. In 1914, people thought it's going to be a quick war, right? And non-state actors can attack mainland USA. So my question would be, which part of your own thesis you think is likely to fail, although you're extremely confident about it? I know it's a tricky question.
I mean, when you say my thesis, I've written a lot. So
I mean, fundamentally.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd say probably where I would be weakest is probably in terms of the role of technology in future war. In part, this comes from a relative lack of technological and sort of technical knowledge of how many systems work and how they're used and so on. So it makes it hard to imagine how they then interact with each other. But then also because technology or some aspects of technology now appear to be changing so rapidly that what might not be something which might only be technically possible now might become tactically preferred in a few months. And if that preference becomes sufficiently sort of both widespread and sort of strong in terms of attitudes, then that might also then have potential strategic, if not or outright geopolitical consequences. And that's, I mean, the problem is to quote the legendary American baseball player Yogi Berra, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And when prediction involves tracing sort of a technological change then into much larger consequences or potentially much larger consequences, you're dealing with an ever-increasing scope of contingency and uncertainty, which means that sort of if I were to imagine sort of the future of warfare 5 years from now, first off, question, whose warfare? Who are we talking about, right? And what do they have available? But then that's a lot to try to account for. But then that's true if you're a skeptic of sort of technological change and its potential for revolutionary effects on the battlefield. It's equally true if you're a lover of technology and you are predicting revolutionary change on the battlefield, because we're still facing the same basic problems of contingency and uncertainty and just the basic contextual details, which at this present moment we simply don't have available to sort of inform our ideally, you'd hope, relatively grounded imagination of the future. But it basically comes down to, when you think about the future, you are using your imagination. And so imagination can be logically bound. Ideally, it would be in this regard. But even something like history, then if you're trying to play it into the future, you're still trying to imagine it. You're trying to imagine how technological systems work, how political systems work, how they interact, and so on and so forth. And once you're imagining, in a relative absence of hard data, there are things you can know about the future. Like geography is not going to substantially change, right? We know what capabilities Chinese naval warfare in 10 to 15 years will have, because they're building them now, and we can see them from satellite and so on. So there are things we can know more or less for sure. But then there's so much else, which is just, when you mentioned about the generals caught in traffic, there's so much which is just very, very particular conditions and contexts which we could not imagine at this point in time without it perhaps turning into a movie plot, right? Like, if prior to February, March 2022, you had imagined a Ukrainian comedian telling the world that, I don't need ride, I need ammunition, people think that's from a movie, not real life.
Right.
So,
and then it happens, and you're like, "Oh, we're here now."
We are here now. But it just sort of goes to show just how hard it is, one, to anticipate reality in certainly all of its details, in even in many of its details, perhaps even in enough details to do anything sensible. But ideally, we can manage that more or less. Though, as you sort of asked at the very beginning, with assumptions always being wrong, even that's somewhat questionable. But then also, even if you imagine something, even if it ends up being true or true enough, because it's your own imagining, ultimately, can you convince anyone else? This is Cassandra from the Trojan War, cursed by the gods to know the truth of what's going to happen, but at the same time, never to be able to convince anyone.
Right.
So that's a fun place to end.
That is a fun place to end. And yeah, the coming months and years are going to be interesting.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. But it's going to be. I don't see it ending right away. I wish it ended with the podcast. We ended it here and the wars ended, but that's not how the world works.
No, that isn't how the world works.
Lukas, thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure.
If there is one takeaway, it's this: war is unpredictable. And just because you're powerful does not guarantee the desired outcome. That is exactly where strategy lives and often fails. You're listening to Inflection Zero. I'm Shomik Mukherjee. Until next time.